Please welcome Politico's defense reporter, Paul McLeary, British ambassador to the United States, Dame Karen Pierce, German ambassador to the United States, Andreas Michaelis, Canadian ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman, and Swedish ambassador to the United States, Ahlin.
Hi everyone, if you get back in your seats so we can get started.
See, that packed audience wasn't for us.
Absolutely, yeah. But our advantage is usually that we can bring collaborators.
Hi, so we'll get started as everyone files in. Thank you so much, ambassadors, for joining us here today. I know you're all very busy this week and last week at the NATO summit. You know, we're here in Milwaukee just a week after the end of the NATO summit in Washington that really locked in some really key gains for Ukraine and solidified kind of the NATO's role in coordinating aid for Ukraine and giving them some guarantees, the irreversibility guarantee that they'll be a member of NATO one day in the future. That's still unspecified. This convention is coming at a time of some real political change in the United States and in Europe. With elections in the UK, it's going to be an election in Canada next year. Obviously, elections in the United States with some big changes in control over governments, and the European Parliament changes there. So there's a lot happening. So if we can just jump right in with the news of the week, I guess pick one element of the news of the week. There's been a lot happening. J.D. Vance being nominated as Trump's running mate. He's made a lot of critical comments about the U.S. posture overseas militarily. He has criticized U.S. aid to Ukraine, saying when he's a candidate for Senate in February 2022, after the Russian invasion, he said, "I got to be honest with you, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another." Obviously, President Trump, if elected, will be the president, not J.D. Vance, but he'll have a big voice in the administration. If the United States does pull aid for Ukraine and leaves it up to the Europeans, Ambassador Pierce, we would start with you. As the U.S., America's closest ally, what would it mean for Ukraine and for NATO if the United States were to pull aid from Ukraine?
Well, that's a big if.
Right.
And it depends who is the next administration, obviously. And people say things in opposition. But when they're actually in power, then they have the weight of that responsibility. So I don't want to put words in President Trump's or J.D. Vance's mouth. But I did want to say that Europe really is pulling its weight on Ukraine. It's something like $193 billion given by Europe. 15 billion of that has been from the UK. And what we're really talking about isn't just the security of Ukraine, we're talking about the security of all NATO partners. If Putin is seen to win in Ukraine, that emboldens China, which directly affects the United States, but it also sets back Euro-Atlantic security right back 30 years to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I don't think anyone wants that. And I don't think the next administration would want its time in office to be dominated by that question of lost Euro-Atlantic security.
And so, Mr. Ambassador, how do you feel about this rhetoric about, I mean, it took months for the last U.S. assistance package for Ukraine to make it through Congress. There's been some real issues in the United States about funding here. What are your conversations like with the current administration and with folks in the Trump administration about Ukraine and about NATO and about the alliance?
Right. Yeah, I think what is really important is that when you look at the last assistance package of the US for Ukraine, that was actually designed for a longer period. So don't mistake it for not having agreed on another package here. That is very substantial, and I think the whole discussion about the supplemental was interesting for us, because as you know, that took a long time until it was finally adopted by Congress. But during that time, I think we had the opportunity of sharing arguments, and as we can see, because things went forward in the end, these arguments must have been convincing. So I'm not so concerned at this point about the level of support that comes from the US, and I'm certainly not concerned about the level of support that comes from the Europeans, because as the UK ambassador has said, we are looking at two different levels in which we have to produce convincing answers. One is the direct support, the military support, and also macroeconomic support for Ukraine. The other is how do we structurally and also in terms of resources, how do we respond at the level of NATO? And I think we are responding at both levels. Just to give you an example, because we have been criticized for a long time. Germany has been criticized for not reaching the 2% of GDP defense expenditure. We now reach the 2%. And if you translate this in absolute figures, it really gives the relevant picture. Because since 2014, the Wales Summit, when the 2% were agreed, we actually increased our defense expenditure threefold, 3 times, from $30 billion to $90 billion. So in terms of actual investment, things are happening, and we fully understand that the support of Ukraine hinges on a joint effort.
And to follow up on that quickly, President Trump has said if elected, he will negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine before he's sworn in January. That would complicate matters, I would imagine, politically, as he is not yet president of the United States and he's practicing diplomacy. How, as an ally, would you prepare for this kind of extra diplomatic effort by an elected official who is not yet sworn in?
First and foremost, this is a question you need to put to the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian government, because they are the shareholders here. It's about their sovereignty, it's about their territory, it's about the war that has been, without having been provoked or in any way with a Ukrainian role brought about, that has been unleashed by Russia. As far as we are concerned, of course, at some point you also have to enter a political game here. The question is, do you do that in a unified, in a well-prepared way on the basis of Ukrainian agreement and looking at the battlefield in a situation where you are not weak so that you know that you will exit these negotiations with a wrong result? I think that's very much, at this point in time, the way I would describe it. And so by itself, the ambition of also addressing these issues in a political way are not wrong, but they should be done in a well-prepared way. And if you ask me, not in the open public, because you're destroying the prices for a deal like this.
Ambassador Hillman, to keep on that subject for a moment, there's an element in the Republican Party that rejects the notion that Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine is an existential threat for Ukraine and more broadly for the West and for NATO. What are your discussions like in trying to make the case that this is a threat? And again, to follow up on that, how would you talk to the incoming Trump administration if they did pursue peace talks before they're sworn in between Russia and Ukraine?
Okay. So I think first, just on Ukraine in general, just to add to my European colleagues, I mean, Canada has been there since the beginning and will be there until Ukraine prevails and is satisfied with getting the Russian incursion out of their territory. So we will be there. We're the second largest country donor to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, and we will not be leaving. And to sort of pivot then to the second part of your question, obviously we are doing this because we are committed to peace in Europe. We are committed to doing everything that we can to support the incredibly brave Ukrainian people. But we're also doing it because it is essential that Russia and Vladimir Putin not be empowered through a victory. And that is important for Europe, but it's very important for North America. So in our latest defense policy, Canada has been quite targeted in our policy where we're putting our money and where we're putting our efforts. And primary among that is in the Arctic, and our Arctic capabilities, our Arctic awareness, our ability to defend our sovereignty in the far north. The reason for that, there's a few reasons. One is because climate change is making that area much more navigable, which is opening it up to commerce, but it is also opening it up to a much greater national security and sovereignty threat. So to the Trump administration that may come in, to those that we're talking to now within those circles, but to all of our American allies on the Hill, when these discussions are happening and when there are those who are questioning continued U.S. support, our message is this is also about North American security. This is also about making sure that we are able to demonstrate clearly and forcefully with our allies that this kind of incursion isn't possible, because we have a northern flank that requires protecting as well, and protecting specifically from Russia and from China.
Is the idea of the Russian threat to North America, has that sunk in? Do you think in all corners in Washington? I know in Europe it has. How about in Ottawa and in Washington?
I think with many who are really thinking carefully about this issue, I think we are making headway with those who hadn't thought of it before. If I can put it that way. But these are things that require, consistent and persistent discussions. But yes, I do feel the message is getting through. And we're deeply committed to North American territorial sovereignty and North American protection in the context of NATO and allied protection.
Ambassador Ahlin, at the NATO summit last week, there's a lot of talk about Trump-proofing the alliance. This is kind of opening up the new NATO office in Wiesbaden to help coordinate arms transfers to Ukraine, the irreversible language, things like that. What is your take on how necessary that is? And are these things NATO was going or should have done anyway? Or is there a concern about the isolationist tendency in the Republican Party and what might be happen in the Trump administration?
We joined the military alliance because it is a military alliance. Mm-hmm. We realize that Russia is a threat. It's an existential threat. If we don't stop them in Ukraine, they will continue and will be a threat to us. So for the first questions, I would like to add to what my colleague said, that if it's about the cost will be much higher if we don't stop the Russians now. So I mean, if the United States would like to save money, the right way to do that is actually to help the Ukrainians to win this war. And second, I've heard on this Republican convention many times how important it is that you, as a citizen, abide to the law. And I agree with that. But it is also important that countries abide to the international law. And the Russians have broken every law there is. And of course, there needs to be a reaction to that. So we joined NATO because we think it's important having an alliance that can stand up for security in the world. We want to be security providers. We see the threat from the Russians. And I think the NATO summit was a success. We were bigger, more united, and stronger than ever. And I think it is logical that NATO actually plays a role in supporting Ukraine in many different ways. And I think that is really, really good that we are doing that. So, when it comes to the end of it all, we need to understand that we are in this together. As Karen, my British colleague, said, if Russia wins this, and it will be seen as has been winning this, It will embolden the other countries like Iran, North Korea, and China. And it won't stop in Ukraine. And I really would like to say that to everyone that is listening here, we should have learned the lessons from what Putin has done before, in Georgia, in Crimea, and now. It won't stop until we stop him.
And stopping him, do you think that Ukraine can take back Crimea and can take back areas of the Donbass? Or do you think that that would be bargaining chips in any peace negotiation?
I think it's absolutely possible that they can do that. It depends on how much support they can have. But in the end, it's like my German colleague said, the question should be asked to the Ukrainians. They are the ones to decide when to stop this war or come into a peace agreement. It's not up to us to tell them. Our work is actually to support them fighting off an aggressor.
And come back, Ambassador Pierce. We're talking about the Republican Party. Obviously, the Democratic Party, Joe Biden's in some trouble. There's a lot of talk about him dropping out of the race as soon as this weekend, possibly Kamala Harris being the nominee on the Democratic ticket. Does that change your interactions with the administration at all, or how do you plan for that uncertainty in the White House at this moment?
I don't think it changes things, to be honest, Paul. Our job as diplomats, my job as British ambassador, is to get to know American political leaders from all parties, future possible leaders, people who might have prominent positions in both parties. And our job is to have the best possible working relationship with the American administration of the day and to whoever each party chooses to lead it. So we will work just as well with whoever is the next president, as I hope we have done with past presidents.
And obviously Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are here. Does that, have you met with them while you're here? And how does that affect what you do in your conversations with some of the Republicans, that there are former prime ministers here speaking with the Trump team and making plans or huddling with the Republicans?
I think it's a symbol of just how close ties are between parliamentarians and political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. And when we all go to the Democratic Convention in Chicago, there'll be people there who might have been British political leaders in the past, but are certainly on the Labour sister party side. So it's something we do every time there's a convention. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are not here with the government, they're here as private individuals, and so our conversations don't impinge on each other. But I will just say that you probably all saw the photograph of Boris Johnson and the caption about talking about Ukraine. Yes. So just to underscore that, at least in the UK, but I think for my colleagues, Ukraine is a bipartisan issue for us. Support for Ukraine is a bipartisan issue.
And Mr. Ambassador, in the last Trump administration, he did call for pulling U.S. troops out of Germany, transferring the air wings to Italy and Belgium and other places. That's something that Robert O'Brien has brought up, his former national security advisor, several times over the past few weeks. Is there concern there that this issue will come up again? And how big of an effect would that have on the relationship, security relationship and political, between Berlin and Washington if there was a big move of U.S. forces into Poland and other places outside of Germany?
Look, we find ourselves in a different situation if you look at security in Europe. That was certainly a discussion that happened in an environment where an imminent confrontation with the Russian Federation was not foreseen. So we find ourselves in a completely different scenario now, and US forces, certainly you made reference also to Wiesbaden, are very much needed in Europe also to coordinate the support which we give to Ukraine during the war. And of course, as a deterrence, it's very important that they remain where they are. But, you know, we also have Eurocom. Besides Eurocom, we have AFRICOM that are based in Germany. So if you look at military operations in Africa, you also need US soldiers present in Germany at the same time. So sometimes the story is a bit more complex. But I think I understand the gist of your question. And here again, what really matters is that if we keep troop presence, for instance, in Europe, US troop presence, we have to produce a convincing answer that we commit ourselves at the same time. And here I have a very good example, because Germany has just decided for the first time in the history of post-war Germany to station on a permanent basis a brigade on the eastern front of or perimeter of NATO in Lithuania. That's very meaningful. I mean, I served in the German forces. I know what a brigade is. We're talking about 2,000 vehicles here. This is really big in terms of actual deployment. And it sends a very, very important signal, because up to that point and up to the attack of Russia on Ukraine, we were honoring the so-called NATO-Russia Founding Act, which, on the basis of an agreement between us and the Russian Federation, contained a provision that NATO would not station troops in those member states of the alliance that had joined us after the end of the Cold War. Now, that is completely different, because the conditions that were defined in this agreement were changed by Russia, and that's why we feel confident and justified to actually push forward. I think for the alliance, that is a very, very important move forward. For us, it's new territory. We never had German troops stationed on a permanent basis in another country. And so, in a way, we will go through a similar experience like the US goes when they station troops in Germany. But for the alliance as a total defense entity, I think it's very, very important.
And does it make planning, NATO planning, more difficult that there is there's so many questions in the United States about who will be the next president? Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden. How do you move forward, and how do you prevent Vladimir Putin from maybe trying to take advantage of the situation, pressing forward in Ukraine or Moldova? I mean, all these these things he's been talking about, nuclear exercises in Belarus. Do you think this is a moment where he can seize on and create some more chaos?
You ask me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think, like my UK colleague has said, we will deal with those responsible in the US, in Washington, and we've done it in the past. The two of us, if I may say, when we were political directors of our foreign services, we were negotiating during the first Trump administration's aspects and important aspects of the Iranian nuclear program. So we are not without experience when it comes to this. And certainly, there will be different priorities, most likely. There will be questions, but we'll take it on. I think we are confident that this most important bilateral relationship, now speaking for Germany, will certainly continue in a win-win context for both sides. That's important.
And Ambassador Hillman, another proposal floated by former President Trump is to put a 10% tariff on all goods imported into the United States. Canada being a huge trade partner, if this were to happen, what kind of effect do you think this would have on relations, Canada's economy, and trade between the two countries?
So I think I would start by saying that Canada and the US have the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. It's about $3.7 billion a day in bilateral trade. And it touches every region and every community in this country. We are the #1 customer by far for the US. And that fact means that the relationship is a job creator here in the US across the country. And we're also very deeply integrated in our business relations. So under the last Trump administration, and in fact this is why I was brought here to Washington, well, not here, it's not Washington, but brought to Washington, we renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA. And that was under the Trump administration. And it was a huge success, and he deems it a huge success, and rightly so. It modernized this enormous, the rules governing this enormous trilateral relationship. And as between Canada and the United States, it brought us down to 99% tariff-free relationship. So 99% of the goods that cross between our countries are tariff-free. And that's an outcome that was negotiated by former President Trump himself. So all of this is to say that if he is reelected, and if this policy of 10% tariffs across the board is sought to be applied to us, the NAFTA partners, I'll speak maybe just for my country, for Canada, I think we'll have an important conversation to have because we just negotiated something quite different. I think that we will be eager to point out how challenging that could be for US consumers, not only because it will make the products that they seek to buy, as I say, $2.7 billion a day in trade more expensive, but inevitably our government would be under enormous pressure to reciprocate. So then we have a 10% tariff on that volume of trade for American goods coming into our country, which is not a particularly constructive posture for us both to be in. We were there before with this administration, and ultimately it was through discussions with Americans around this country who were able to talk to the economic leaders within the Trump administration to say, this is hurting our community, this is challenging. Can we find a way to achieve our policy goals with Canada and Mexico at the time without engaging in this kind of back and forth on this just enormously important economic driver for our country. So we're talking to Trump advisors on this. We are really urging them to consider what the implications of applying that would be. And I guess I would end by saying, back to where I started with the very successful renegotiation of the NAFTA, Canada and the US had the biggest year of bilateral trade in the history of our two countries last year. And before that, the biggest year was the one previous. So this relationship is so strong and growing, and it's frankly, not exclusively, but I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that we renegotiated this foundation of our trading relationship and have stable, secure, predictable rules in place for our businesses. So these are very positive things. We will be very eager to urge the administration not to disrupt this very positive trajectory that we're on. And I'm quite confident because I find that when you talk in real facts about real world implications for communities, I think that that's how we can get through. Ultimately, the Trump Vance ticket, and we heard it last night, they're interested in jobs for Americans. They're interested in prosperity for Americans, and we are too. I don't think there's any country up here that doesn't want the United States to be prosperous and safe and secure, right? That's important for all of us.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Ambassador, new member of NATO, you already hit the 2% of GDP for spending, so you're going to be in the good graces with the Trump administration there, right? Very robust defense industry. How would you approach this 10% tariff issue? If it happens, it's going to be a sticking point, and there's going to have to be bilateral deals, right?
I would like to start with the starting point there that Sweden has indeed a strong defense industry because when we were neutral, military, non-aligned, we wanted to be trustworthy neutrals and trustworthy military non-aligned. So that's why we do our own fighter jets and submarines and tanks and so on. So I think we bring more than just 2% to the table. And I fully agree with having the 2% as a floor. I think most European countries do realize that we need to increase because of the threat from Russia and from others in the world. But it is also that some countries have a lot of defense industry capacity. Germany is one, so you need to look at the whole mixture, so to say. Also to operational planning, since you asked that question about if people are concerned about Trump winning the election. We are in the process of now being integrated into operational planning in NATO, which goes very well. And I can assure you that the operational planning that I have learned about doesn't take into account if Biden wins or Trump wins, it's strictly military operational planning, how we can be a military alliance, deter the threats. And I think that is very reassuring. They are not looking upon who will win the election in the United States and we should change our military operational planning. They don't do it like that at all, which is very good. If Trump goes ahead, if he wins the election and he goes ahead with increased tariffs, the first effect will be, of course, that prices will increase for American consumers. Sweden, as many other countries here on stage, we are very export-oriented. We believe in a market economy where companies are better because they are competing with each other. In the long run, the prosperity of a country can only be built if companies are producing better product to a cheaper price than others. And to have that is not by being supported by tariffs or political regulations. It's actually out there in the market economy where you foster a product that is cheap and better than the competitor. And that is the only way in the long run to create prosperity. And sometimes I'm surprised. The United States is the most innovative country in the world. The biggest companies are all here. The unemployment is low, and so on. And we know that there are problems, of course. But if you look upon it on a global view, the United States is very well positioned.
And yet there's talk of these tariffs. And Ambassador Pierce, how would you tackle this economic issue with the tariff? I mean, that's going to hang over everything, right, if this happens. And it's going to require a lot of diplomacy on the ground, right? I mean, a lot of economic talks. Is this something that you've been working on or you're concerned about?
It's something that we have talked to successive American administrations about over the years. We have done sectoral deals, the EU and the UK, reached an agreement over what are called 232 tariffs that involve whiskey, involve bourbon. There was another deal on large civil aircraft. There was another deal on steel. So sector by sector, you can tackle these things. But I would say, I think America has a different philosophy towards tariffs than Europe does. Going back hundreds of years, American trade policy has often been characterized by tariffs in a way that we do not apply. So we've got to talk about that philosophical difference, if you like. The other thing I'd say is to encourage Americans to believe that it is strategically in their interests for their close allies to have competitive, healthy industries. This gets us into the question of economic security, friendshoring rather than onshoring. It's very much in America's interest that her allies believe in free enterprise and have healthy economies. And an open trading system is a key part of that.
And Mr. Ambassador, Germany also has obviously a strong defense industry. And there's a movement for strategic autonomy, right, in Europe, for Europeans to buy more European weaponry and military equipment. Which kind of flies in the face of the Joe Biden's Buy America, and also flies in the face of the Trump former administrations and possibly future. They're pushed for Europeans and others around the world to buy more American defense equipment. There's going to be tension here no matter who wins the election.
It's amazing you're asking that question because the facts are different, at least as far as we are concerned. Because we were out shopping in the US, heavily, because as I've said at the beginning, we decided to invest seriously into our armed forces and address deficiencies. So if you want figures like 60 UH-47 Chinook helicopters, 35 F-35s, and we had not ordered, we were not part of that group. So altogether, we've signed contracts at the value of $23 billion within a very short period. So the picture is totally different. Why did we do it? Because the defense industrial base in Europe, in Germany, could not provide the equipment which we needed. So we bought, if you want, off the shelf. So what's the story here? The story, when you look at Ukraine, because until August last year, as a deputy secretary, I was in charge of our Ukraine policy in terms of the actual support measures which we adopted and which we needed to negotiate it. So we held an ammunition summit in the Chancellor's office because we couldn't procure ammunition because it wasn't produced. So we had to bring industry around the table to encourage them to start to produce again. I know from my time here that when you look, for instance, at shipbuilding capacity for the Navy, there's very little in the US. I mean, you could spend more money on the Navy if you had more yards. So we need to restructure, and I think the story here is that we need to integrate across the Atlantic to an extent we haven't integrated in the past. Our defense industries have to come together in terms of developing equipment jointly and in terms of providing production facilities that give us a resilience which we absolutely need under these conditions.
The issue of co-production is something that NATO's been talking about for several years now.
Yeah.
It's made some gains, but that's tough, right? Because you're asking German companies to maybe hire Americans in the United States or Americans to hire in Germany, and American companies to hire in Germany. Do you think this is feasible for private companies or state-run companies to really do this and really collaborate like that?
Yeah, it's already happening, for instance. If you look at the German company Rheinmetall, for instance, they are the guys who produce the German main battle tank. They are part of now building parts of the F-35 because they are into steel welding, etc. So if we procure in the way we are procuring at the moment, that will translate also in specific production decisions and structures. And at the end of the day, there will certainly be also unique European developments. It just depends on the kind of defense equipment we are looking at. But the more we can do together, look at, for instance, if I'm not mistaken, I think soon a decision will have to be taken about the successor to the Bradley, the infantry fighting vehicle.
We've been trying to do that for 20 years.
So, yeah, but it has to happen,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
So why not do something together here? Because we have learned in Europe that one of the main obstacles really is that we have too many different weapon systems. If you look at the artillery, which we have given to the Ukrainians, and we are looking mainly at 155 millimeter artillery, they are just not interoperable in terms of the ammunition that is being used in these barrels, and that should not be the case in such an important alliance as NATO, and here we have a joint way forward, very clearly.
Yeah, I think as NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and people in the Pentagon have said they want interchangeability, not interoperability, which is very nerdy. But
Can I add just
Please.
something to this? Because I think this is a really important point. So last week at NATO, the United States, Canada, and Finland, we announced an icebreaker pact.
Yeah.
And it's precisely what you're talking about. So Canada has very advanced icebreaker technology. Finland has its, and we are deciding as a trio to get together and share information on that technology, share information on how to be the very best among the three of us, use all of our knowledge together, and then manufacture in each of our three countries, but by bringing our knowledge and experience together for ourselves and then for our allies. I think that this is a very good sign, and I think there's no reason why we can't do this across the board with respect to military equipment production.
And to stay with you, Ambassador Hillman, real quickly, we only have a few minutes left, so Canada has a plan, announced at NATO, to get to 2% by 2032. There's elections next year. I don't think there's a lot of details in the 2% plan yet. How do you lock this in to make sure if the Trudeau government does change over to someone else, that the next government keeps moving forward on these long-term defense investments?
Well, I think that the answer is that we must. We have capabilities that we must refresh. It was last week our Minister of Defense announced that we will be buying a new fleet of submarines.
Right.
right? And that fleet of submarines in and of itself, he said, will take us over 2%. That process has started now and will continue on. And that's just one of about 5 or 6 large acquisitions that are coming down the line, armored vehicles, and I mean, I could list it all. But so I think that it is a path that Canada is on as a nation. I don't think it's a partisan issue. I think there is support across, both of our major parties for Canada to continue down this path. So I don't think that that's really, something of real concern.
Okay, and wrapping up, Ambassador Ahlin, easy one. Donald Trump has called into question the Article 5 of the NATO Charter, saying if there's an attack on one country, every country will defend. He's saying if you don't pay up, Putin can do whatever the hell he wants. As the newest member of NATO, how confident are you that the United States would come to your aid if you were attacked by Russia?
I'm totally confident.
And have you spoken to folks in the
I
Trump
am
orbital?
Totally confident that everyone understands what a military alliance is.
And everyone on stage, you're confident that the United States will, under any administration, abide by the Article 5? Because there's been some question from the man who might be the next president about whether he'd want to do that or not. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate your time during a very busy week. And everyone, thanks for coming. Please subscribe to the National Security Daily newsletter for Politico. It comes out every day about 4 p.m. And it has reporting from our whole team, original reporting, and links to stories that we had done throughout the day. So please subscribe. Thank you very much.